I'm going to be looking at the question of genocide and the Gaza war, and at all the aspects which Dan mentioned. Uh, there we are. So I want to start really by talking about how we approach genocide generally and how I approach it in particular. First of all, I think we need to recall that this was originally a concept proposed by Raphael Lemkin in 1944 as a possible extension of international law. And it was from the start both a legal and a sociological concept, because although it was proposed as a new legal instrument, it was also proposed as a way of understanding the phenomena which we now call genocide. And Lemkin's concept was broad. It included not just the killing of people, but the destruction of society and culture, economy, political systems, etc. Lemkin saw genocide as multi-dimensional, so it was a broad concept, but it was also a concept which has been seen by many people as having rather unstable foundations, because Lemkin linked together quite wide variations of actions, between the one extreme, if you like, or the one pole, the total mass murder of the Holocaust of the Jews in the later stages of the Second World War, and the lesser but still very terrible things that happened to other peoples in that war. And many people, for example, Dirk Moses, who has recently written a book called The Problems of Genocide, argue that this combination is unstable. So Lemkin outlined the concept uniquely, really, in the history of major concepts. It was embodied in the International Genocide Convention only 4 years after he published his book. So this is an incredible turnaround, really, of ideas from one man writing a book to an international convention, which ultimately the majority of states have signed up to, and which we can see playing out now in an important way in this conflict. And the convention has, I think the present context shows, and I'm going to argue this a bit more detail later, it shows that the convention actually does have teeth, and it is potentially a very significant document. But it has also been seen as having many defects, and I haven't got time to go into these. If you're studying genocide, though, a lot of what you'll be studying is the defects of the way that the convention defines things. For example, which groups are protected by genocide? Is it just ethnic and national groups, or is it a wider range, such as, for example, what are called political groups? But that's only one of many issues. There's the issue of intention. What does it mean to say that genocide is an intentional or deliberate act on the part of the perpetrators? And many both lawyers and social scientists who've looked at it argue that it needs to be understood in a critical way. The other context in which the genocide idea became powerful, especially really during the Cold War period, because the convention was agreed in 1948, and that's really when the Cold War was starting. And for the next 40 years, it wasn't really used because the Cold War superpowers couldn't agree on how to use it. And so it became, though, an idea that was very powerful and invoked by just about every group that found itself on the receiving end of extensive violence. And so it became a powerful political and ideological idea. Often, you might say sometimes abused, but also used in quite powerful ways that were relevant to real tragedies. As a result of the problems of the Genocide Convention definition, there have been various alternative definitions proposed, especially by sociologists and other social scientists. So on the one hand, sometimes it's been narrowed to a Holocaust-like events, rather than being seen as a broad concept of many types of many kinds of events. And as a result of that, sometimes other concepts have become important, because if we narrow the concept of genocide to only certain types of mass killings and other crimes, then you need other concepts to describe what's going on. And so, for example, the concept of ethnic cleansing has become a very commonly used concept in the last 30 years to describe the forced removal of populations. Although if you take the Lemkin definition or the Genocide Convention definition, literally, forced removal of populations could be considered a means of genocide. In the last 30 years, especially since the end of the Cold War, the convention has started to become seriously used in legal contexts, although intermittently and you might say erratically. And as a result of this, there is now a serious body of legal case law and legal interpretations which have been built up. And my critique of this is really that there have been some unfortunate tendencies in the legal the jurisprudence. For example, the idea of the intentionality of genocide has been reified to become an almost impossible standard to meet. And ideas have been put forward such as that genocide can only be proved if it is the only possible inference from the acts that are taking place. And I would argue that there are many cases, because genocide often occurs in the context of war, where because the perpetrator power is simultaneously fighting a war, carrying out military action against armed enemies, and also carrying out violence against civilians, where you can't really separate these so easily. And so I think this sort of demand in for example, in the International Court of Justice has made it very difficult to prove genocide legally, even though in a broader sense, in a sociological sense, we would say that it has been carried out. So my approach is fundamentally historical sociological. I'm not a lawyer, and I see genocide as an intentional process and a set of actions of social destruction, the destruction of a societal framework, as well as physical destruction of a population. Those are two different sides to genocide. For me, the physical destruction goes along usually with the social destruction. Some of the legal discussion tends to focus it too much, I think, too exclusively on the physical destruction. The other thing that I insist on, which I think is important, is that genocide generally does occur in the context of war, as it is doing in Gaza, as you might argue it is in a different way in Ukraine. And so that looking at genocide sociologically, we need to look at how this phenomenon is linked to the phenomenon of war. And really we have to see them as hybrid phenomena, which are interconnected so deeply that it's we distinguish them, but they are part of the same whole set of practices. So that's where I'm starting from. Let's now talk a bit about the background in Israel-Palestine and how genocide can apply here. If we, in discussion of what is happening, what Israel has been doing in Palestine in the last 75 years, and in fact one could take it a bit longer, various writers have now proposed different sorts of frames which you will find in the genocide literature which can be applied to this case. So for example, the frame of settler colonialism, which is the most common frame, because the Jewish settlers colonists in Palestine came from Europe mostly, and were settling themselves, or trying to create a sort of colony, although it wasn't the colony of a great power, so that's in that way it's a very distinctive thing, out in a territory which was mainly inhabited by non-Jews, by Arabs, before the large-scale Jewish community developed. that frame has been applied, which is a frame which is used in a lot of analysis. There's been a lot of analysis of settler colonial genocide in North America, in Australasia, and other parts of the world. Another frame which is relevant is the frame of exclusive nationalism, because the Zionist movement, which led the Jewish colonization of Palestine, was derived from Europe, and it was a Jewish version of the nationalism which was developing widely in Eastern Europe and in Europe more generally in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it has many counterparts in the exclusive national of regimes that were established in Eastern Europe around that time. So that's another frame that you can apply. Final frame, which I think is important, although other writers haven't emphasized it as much, is the frame of contested colonization, or decolonization rather, contested decolonization, because the Jewish state in Palestine has become controversial precisely in the period that colonization generally has become controversial, and decolonization has been a very powerful process. So this is another way in which this is different from other colonial cases. Most of the other colonial cases, we're talking about things that started in the 17th, 19th centuries. Really, the Jewish colonization of Palestine only gets underway in a big way in the 20th century. And by that time, the whole context around colonialism has changed. And so the Palestinians have a very powerful national movement in the way that many other indigenous colonized peoples did not have in the 19th century, for example. So that's a sort of theoretical framing. Historical framing, I think we can just see how powerful different types of genocide themes have been in the history, and really how they've been part of the political history of Palestine since the middle of the 20th century. So, I mean, first of all, we have the context of the Nazism and the Holocaust, which drove many Jews to flee much of Europe in the 1930s and before the Second World War, as well as during the Second World War and at its end. And of course, Jews who fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe or fascist regimes in Europe were not able, in many cases, to go very easily to other places, to the United States and Britain, for example, blocked or reduced to a tiny trickle the number of Jewish refugees who could come to our countries. So although the Zionist project predated this period, the Jewish migration to Palestine was really very powerfully influenced by fascism and the Holocaust. And so that is, very important, of course. And of course, that is an enormously important part of Jewish and also specifically Israeli identity. But then, of course, we have the Nakba, the destruction of the majority of Palestinian society in Israel in 1948. And this is an episode which is obviously equally powerfully foundational for the Palestinian people. Although Palestinians were not killed in the same way as Jews were killed in Europe, Palestinian society was destroyed. If we take my social definition of genocide, then it fits pretty well with what was happening in Palestine at that time. But the numbers of Jews, of Palestinians rather, who were massacred by the emerging Israeli forces was much smaller than in many other cases of genocide. So that's that kind of case. And really the history since then has not allowed genocide questions to go away, because Israel has been expanding in what has been called sometimes a slow motion genocide or slow motion extension of genocide in the occupied Palestinian territories and establishing colonies. And of course, that's something which has accelerated in the last decade. And then, of course, there's the history of the wars in Gaza since the 2000s, or in fact, we could include the Lebanon War in 2006 as well. These these wars, combined with the blockade, also raise genocide questions, although in a much smaller way than they have been raised by recent events. Because in these wars that occurred in the last 15 years or so, we've had episodes where hundreds or numbers in the low thousands of Palestinians have been killed at the same time as there has been extensive destruction, but nothing like, of course, what we have seen today. And of course, in each of these cases, it has been possible to rebuild Gaza after the Israeli onslaughts. But this and these episodes have raised this question of genocidal terminology, which has become important in recent debate. The idea of mowing the grass is this interesting phrase that was uttered by an Israeli general, I think, in 2014, and then became standard terminology. It's now every people use it as a way of describing what Israel was trying to do. They're trying to use brutal and extensive violence for a short period to batter down the Gazan Palestinian population and batter down Hamas, of course, as well, in order to keep control. So that's the context of previous episodes. What's going on today, of course, is something I think much more than that. So this new war, how are we doing? Yeah, this new war, the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October, in terms of the genocide literature, I think can be described as genocidal massacres. These were massacres of Israeli citizens in the kibbutzim and in the peace festival, or the music festival rather, that was taking place, where civilians were being slaughtered simply because they were Israelis, and with a unhealthy dose of anti-Semitism laced into that, perhaps. So from my point of view, that these were genocidal massacres. And it's interesting, actually, that Israel did not make a point of claiming these to be genocidal massacres. And I think that is because they were worried that if they allowed the discourse of genocide to get into this conflict, that what they were about to do or began to do themselves might be described in that way. And of course, that is what has happened in any case. So we then saw Israel's representatives in the International Court of Justice saying things like, if genocide has occurred at all in this conflict, then it was Hamas that did it. Well, my perspective is that Hamas carried out genocidal massacres, but of course, Hamas had no capacity to destroy Israeli society as a whole, and no intention. It aimed to carry out terrible destructive massacres as a way of shocking and provoking and establishing a different kind of political narrative. Israel's response, well, I think I don't need to go into a lot of what's actually happened, because I'm sure you'll have been following the news, but their aim was to destroy Hamas. The initial means was this much more extensive bombardment than anything that had happened before. They followed that up with land invasion, which is now moving through different parts of Gaza and arriving now at the final area of large population in Rafah, having been from the Gaza city through Khan Yunis and arriving up in Rafah, where the refugees have fled to. I think there's a fourth element of the Israeli campaign, which has not actually happened yet, but which is part of what they probably want to do, and certainly part of what a lot of Israeli ideologues and politicians want to do, and that is to expel the Gazans out of the Gaza Strip altogether and into Egypt or anywhere else that will have them. And this so far has not happened. So this is not accomplished. But the results that we have are only a partial destruction of Hamas. Most experts agree that Hamas has not really been destroyed. Thousands of Hamas operatives may have been killed, but the organization remains intact. It still is powerful. It's resurfacing in areas where the Israelis have moved on from. But at the same time, near total destruction of the built environment, but also the socio-economic infrastructure of Gazan society. So, you know, all the things which made Gaza a society have been battered and partially, if not wholly, destroyed in the last 4 months. And of course, along with that, we have the near total displacement. So, from my point of view, you know, these aspects of what Israel has done are already genocidal in the sense that they have achieved large-scale social destruction. But of course, then there has also been the physical destruction, which the Genocide Convention talks about, the nearly 30,000 deaths, the 60,000 or so wounded, and the huge numbers who are suffering from disease and starvation in different parts of Gaza. So, as I said, I think that this is both social and physical destruction, and it fits both my broad sociological approach, and also it does fit the narrow convention and definitions of genocide. So, looking more at Israel's method and the question of genocidal intent, because nearly all authorities agree that genocide is a deliberate kind of act. It's not something that happens accidentally or as a byproduct of something. It's something which is intentional. But of course, intention doesn't just amount to public statements. It is also fundamentally what we can infer from, what we can find in the character of the actions that have been taking place. Now, Israel's argument is that the destruction that has taken place is essentially the result of tactics which are designed to defeat Hamas. So from Israel's point of view, there have been targeted attacks on Hamas rather than civilians. And of course, they emphasize that they have given warnings to civilians to move from particular areas. And they emphasize also that their targeting has been vetted by their international lawyers. So Israel pioneered the use of international law as a direct part of military targeting in earlier wars, and they are playing a part. But it's all very good, but the rules have been stretched. So that if you make your targeting rules, if you interpret what is legitimate as the killing of tens or even hundreds of civilians alongside the targeting of one Palestinian Hamas fighter, then of course you're going to get huge scale civilian death alongside very small numbers of militants targeted. I mean, I suppose an interesting example of that was only yesterday or the day before, when the two Israeli hostages released by Israeli action, but as a cover for the operation which released them, they killed nearly 70 Palestinian civilians. So it's this kind of disproportionality that everybody is talking about, and it doesn't really make Israel give Israel a credible case, I believe, according to the laws of war. And of course, even the elements which are appear to be positive, like the warnings which are given, have a downside, because Israel then interprets a situation where they have given warnings as a license to kill anybody who remains after the warnings have been given. So especially if you're a male of military age and you're still in an area where warnings have been given, then you're fair game. And there have been quite a number of incidents of people being shot, even civilians who were obviously civilians, because of that situation. So in order to examine the genocide question, though, we need to look not only at how this targeting has been expanded to allow mass killing, but also at the overall strategic approach to civilian to the targeting of civilians, which Israel is adopting. So I think if we understand the difference in international law, War crimes are, specific breaches of specific regulations concerning the conduct of war. Genocide is a concept of the overall strategy and purpose of an operation, campaign, and it brings together the idea that we need to look at what a state or an armed organization is doing as a whole. And I would argue that what Israel is doing here really is extending its already established doctrine, so-called Dahiya doctrine of disproportionate response, to an overall attempt to destroy the Palestinian society in Gaza. So there are these two things going on at the same time. On the one hand, Israel's war against the Hamas and the other armed groups, and at the same time, a campaign to destroy the social infrastructure of Gaza, and that is where the questions of genocide come in. And I would argue that we can, if we look at the question of intention, we have to say that Israel intended this because they knew from the previous episodes that the sort of campaign they were going to carry out would have the sort of results it has had. These were not unforeseen. They were not accidental results of the campaign. They were very, very foreseeable, very knowable effects, and in that sense must have been intended. And the interesting thing, of course, is that Hamas also knew this. So I think one of the terms I use in my essays on Gaza is co-production, that we could see this Israeli genocide in Gaza, if that is what we describe it as a co-production between the Israeli state and Hamas, because Hamas also must have anticipated something like what has happened and were prepared to pay the price. They were prepared to sacrifice Palestinian civilians, just as, of course, Israel has been prepared to sacrifice many of its hostages. So, I'm just checking on my time. I want to leave a bit of time for discussion. I'm going on a bit longer maybe than I intended, but I'll try to keep it brief. The global politics of this and the ICJ case, I think is very important that Palestine issue has become so globally significant, emblematic of so many other things, that it was inevitably primed to be a major crisis in the way that has occurred. And I think it's interesting really just to compare Ukraine and Gaza, because although in many ways the same considerations apply to Ukraine, and there was a lot of argument about the genocidal character of the Ukraine war, it hasn't had the same impact as it has now in Gaza. Over Gaza, the idea of genocide has become almost universally applied, and many people who would have not accepted that in previous discussions of Israel and Palestine have begun to use that term. And of course, it's had this huge polarizing effect in international politics and in domestic politics, as we see if we look up to Rochdale. It has been a crisis which has exposed the hypocrisy of the West, which of course supports Ukraine, but will not support the Palestinians. And it has been an opening for South Africa to pose as a champion, not just of the Palestinians, but of the global South. So this is the political context. The legal context of the ICJ ruling. One international lawyer described the ruling as rhetorically strong but operationally weak, and I think that's more or less right. I think it is a significant breakthrough. It's very significant because it's the first time that a International Court of Justice case has had this degree of relevance in the middle of a war, and this degree of international political significance. I don't think previous cases, however important, have had those factors. So I think it gave a very powerful indictment of Israel's actions. I think, listening to it, it was really quite moving, and it showed that the potential of international law and indeed of the UN system. It gave authoritative instructions to Israel, although these were couched in the language of the convention, and I think they needed actually to be more explicit. It failed particularly to demand an immediate cessation of military action, which was what South Africa had asked for, which I think was the only thing that really would have really brought the issue entirely to a head. However, because the ICJ asked Israel to report to it within a month on what it had done, I think even the way the decision was couched was very effective. And although the decision may have reflected if this character of the decision may have reflected a sort of political compromise among the judges to get a majority, the fact that they got an overwhelming majority of judges to agree to what they did agree, it makes what they agreed all the more powerful. So just briefly on some sort of conclusions. If Israel withdrew now, it would have accomplished, it has already accomplished the partial physical destruction of the Gazan population and the deep destruction of Gazan society. That's happened and will not be easy to reverse. In Lemkin's language, I think this is a partial genocide that has successfully crippled Gazan society. Lemkin distinguished between crippling and eliminating, and I think this is a type of genocide which cripples rather than eliminates, although it could become elimination, especially if there is mass expulsion. At the moment, that mass expulsion seems to be blocked by Egypt and also maybe by the United States. At the moment, Israel seems to be more or less defying the International Court of Justice, and the way in which UNRWA, the relief organization, has been sabotaged seems to me to demonstrate, underline that intention. But there is still a lot of friction in the sense of factors which may prevent Israel from going the whole hog. One remains within Israel the situation of the hostages and the voice of the hostage families, and the second is the way in which, as the people have become more and more aware of what's going on, the United States support and wider Western support has begun to fade away. And so we've had, David Cameron starting to make more critical noises in the last few days. So it remains to be seen how the International Court of Justice will respond to what Israel is doing, and then how that will play out in the UN and elsewhere. There's a lot still to be decided, and it remains to be seen how this conflict will end. And all I think we know is that for many Palestinians it will be too late. So many people will have died, so many people will have suffered life-changing injuries, and for Gazan society it will be a colossally difficult task to reconstruct unless Israel completely withdraws and there is a major international investment in putting Gaza back together. But it's not easy to see at all how that could happen.